when AI becomes mainstream, the substrate of that intelligence will be data. If you look at all the things that keeps getting released by OpenAI, DeepSeek, and others, is that we are moving towards shorter latency of the response time. You need a database that can manage all different kinds of data, including streaming data, that you can talk to and reason with it and read and write and run analytics in a few milliseconds. I have a more optimistic view of the future where we will be able to automate and do things that are probably lower value to us.
Welcome to the EM360 Tech Podcast, where we have a weekly conversation with people who are impacting the enterprise tech landscape. My name is Shubhangi Dua, an editor and tech journalist at EM360 Tech. In today's episode, I'm joined by Madhukar Kumar, the Chief Marketing Officer at SingleStore, and we are here to discuss real-time AI and its implications for enterprises. Hi, Madhukar. How are you today?
Hi, Shubhangi. Thanks for having me and good to talk to you again.
Before I get into real-time AI, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and how you started working in this particular area, especially how you got into AI and joined SingleStore?
Sure, yeah. How long you've got? Because I started off my career as a journalist, just like yourself.
Oh, wow.
I used to work for Hindustan Times in Delhi. And we figured out at that time, 1997, 99, how to build web pages. So we were converting the entire newspaper into web. So I ended up becoming software engineer from that point onwards, got a degree in software engineering, became a software engineer in tech, then eventually to product management, and then finally to marketing side of things. So in my master's degree in software engineering at that point, there was thinking where a lot of the object-oriented programming, so first of all, the monolithic programming went to object-oriented programming, and then object-oriented programming, one of the hypotheses was it will get into agents, or what we used to call it multi-agent software engineering. So my thesis was on that as part of the master's. But as we got into the tech, I was mostly working with databases first, like Microsoft SQL Server initially, and then later on Redis and Oracle, and then finally at SingleStore. But reason I joined SingleStore was it was right at the cusp of when generative AI really hit us like a massive wave. And at that point, it was clearly becoming very obvious that when AI becomes mainstream, the substrate of that intelligence will be data. And how you manage that data would be extremely important. And the way you harness it is what's going to be a differentiator. So I joined SingleStore 2 years and a few months before, and I've been running both growth and marketing here.
Oh, that's amazing. And with this AI boom, I suppose enterprises have begun integrating AI into their business models. What does real-time AI really mean, and how does it come into the business process?
Yeah, so think of it from the perspective of where AI is headed and what we have already seen. So we started off with generative AI, of course, with the transformers model, and it was primarily text-based. And when it was text-based, it is mostly for information synthesis, which is great. But then eventually the world is moving towards not just information synthesis on what the large language models can do very well, but also doing things with that information that comes back. And that is the agent platform. So if you think about agents, agents are basically consist of three different constructs. One, it has some sort of an intelligence. So that's your large language model. It has tools so that it can affect the environment around it. And those would be API calls for now, for simplicity's sake. And then the third one is access to specific knowledge. So if I am an SEO agent or I am a demand generation agent, then that's the specific knowledge that I have that self-improves. Now, where this is headed, if you look at all the things that keeps getting released by OpenAI, DeepSeek, and others, is that we are moving towards shorter latency of the response time. So OpenAI released the real-time API, I think about a few months ago. And what that enables developers to now do is to build applications where the large language model's response time is within a few milliseconds. Now, why is that important? Because when you embody those agents into physical AI in robotics, now the human computer interaction, or HCI, will turn into human agents interaction, and those agents are both digital software as well as physical. And if you're engaging with robotics with physical AI, the human reaction is in within a few milliseconds. And two, when you put objects in real life, the information that starts feeding in is also in the orders of magnitude in terms of freshness of information that needs to be processed by that AI. So that is what I would call as a real-time AI and why it is going to be table stakes. So the large language model or the agents will have the knowledge of the corpus of data that they have, but they need to process the fast streaming data that's coming to them from their environment and also match it with the previous data in order to be able to respond accurately and in a user experience friendly manner.
Okay, I understand that, but how is that really vital for enterprises today? What sort of advantages does it offer? And if you can explain that with a few examples, like I know the world is talking about DeepSeek a lot, so maybe we can touch upon DeepSeek or OpenAI and how you come into the play there.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, let's tackle the DeepSeek and the evolution. From a large language model, the way it has evolved is it was initially programmed to predict the next token or the next word or the next frame or whatever it is, if it's a multi-model language model. And what people realized was, of course, this is great when you're answering questions very quickly. But if you now give it some reasoning tasks, it's not that very good because it's just predicting the next token. So the next evolution in the large language model was building chain of thoughts. And that is essentially saying that you do reasoning at inference. So similar to humans, it takes more time, but it says, okay, I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to verify, and then you synthesize it. But now what you have done is you have moved the compute for training that data with a very large number of parameters to compute at inference time. So now when I ask the question, it is using the GPUs or whatever it is at that time. So it becomes expensive. So OpenAI released that $200 per month model. What DeepSeek did was using a thing called distillation, a methodology like distillation. It's like a much more knowledgeable teacher teaching a student how to become knowledgeable. So you used distilled knowledge of a larger model to then train the smaller model. And you do it in a way that is, I think, 1/100th of that cost. And then you shift most of that cost of compute at inference, also offload it in a CPUs versus GPUs. That makes it as powerful as the expensive OpenAI reasoning model, but now DeepSeek is also free or extremely cheap, so to speak. So where we come in is if you think about any large language model or AI, you basically, the large language models are not trained on any knowledge within enterprise data. Let's take EM360. You have documents that's stored in your intranet or Google Drive, wherever it is. You have these podcasts, you have these videos, you have these audios. Now, if you want to ask a large language model, whether it's DeepSeek or anything else, and say, okay, what did Shubhangi say in such and such episode? It would not know. So what your application needs to do is to go to your corpus of knowledge, then curate and search it, and then come back and give it to the large language model and say, okay, now go and answer this question. That strategy is called retrieval augmented generation. Now, when you embellish it with entity and edges, like a knowledge graph, it becomes more accurate as well. So that's where RAG has moved on to. But here's the issue. Let's say you and I just said something a few seconds ago, and now somebody's asking that large language model what is a question related to a topic that maybe we have discussed before or we are doing now. And our opinion might be different. Or let's take another example, right? Let's say you have a customer support agent, and a customer support agent is now dealing with all the knowledge that it has access to, the support tickets, knowledge base, and so on. But just a few seconds ago, about 100,000 other people have issues with, let's say, a phone battery. They open a support ticket. And now within the production system, there's a new patch and it has been released and so on. Now, this agent is talking to a customer and customer says, I have a battery issue. If this agent has stale information, which is beyond 2 seconds or whatever, it's not only slow, but it's giving inaccurate information, which causes a cascading effect of revenue as well as customer support and so on. And if you're in healthcare, that's disastrous. If you're in financial services dealing with trillions of dollars, that's even more disastrous. So you need a database that can manage all different kinds of data, including streaming data, that you can talk to and reason with it and read and write and run analytics in a few milliseconds. That's where we come in. That is single store. That is the data interface for AI and agents that allows you to do single shot retrieval. You just give one natural language query. It does the vectors, it does the keyword matches, it does real time streaming data across petabytes of data, and then responds to you in a few milliseconds.
This was going to bring me to my next question. How does it impact things like user experience and rising customer expectations? But I feel like you sort of did answer that. So, looking ahead, what will real time AI look like in practice? Are we talking about interconnected systems, AI agents collaborating, or something else entirely? I mean, this year the buzz has all been about AI agents. So, if we can touch upon that a little bit, that would be great for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So AI agents, when you create an agent, like we talked about, the three different constructs for it, the knowledge, the tools, as well as intelligence. Now, if the knowledge is different for different agents, you're relying on other agents also for modularity and control and so on to do a combined goal-oriented task. Now, there are primarily two ways to manage that. One way is that I create a super agent, like a supervisory agent, like a supervisor, a human, and then they spawn off the smaller agents and says, okay, with my chain of thought, I want you to do this, I want you to do this, and I want you to do this. Now, if each one of them are using different large language models or small language models, whatever they might be, the response that comes back and has a cascading effect on what the supervisory agent does. But those are non-deterministic. Those are probabilistic, because if you give the same task multiple different times, you might get different answers, which might prompt different actions at the supervisory level. So what we saw in the last few months is more of a movement towards a deterministic graph or a flow, where the human decides, no, this agent should only do guardrails or input output validation. And only after this agent has done something, it goes to the next one. And if it fails, then it goes back to this one. And if it succeeds, so you have created a deterministic flow. That's where it is headed towards. Now, along the way, what Anthropic did, I think is pretty significant. And I'm very curious to see where it goes, is they introduced this thing called MCP, or Model Context Protocol. And what that allows agents to do is to be able to reuse tools that have been created by others and then use them. So why is that significant? Because one of those tools is using the browser and the internet along with a keyboard and a mouse. So now whatever a human could do sitting in front of a computer, technically an agent can also do. But you need to be able to then output that somehow and always have human in the loop. So from that perspective, I do think what you pointed out is absolutely correct. There will be more agents collaborating with each other. And I do think there's an evolution of some sort of a protocol that would emerge where these agents are able to talk to each other. But at least in enterprises, I do feel it is probably going to be more deterministic ways of agent collaboration versus probabilistic.
AI agents does sound very scary to me. To be honest with you, it sounds like me as a human, I can have various personal assistants. And if that personal assistant decides to just automate most of my workflow, if I have like several meetings to schedule and I'm not sure if I want to attend all of them, for instance, I'm not saying I'm not going to, but it just automatically fixes that up for me. For example, it's just a little bit scary to think that it could go rogue because it just knows what I want before I even have a chance to think about it.
Yeah, I feel so. I have a slightly different view of this, given that I tend to go play with this in, in actual code. So here's another way to think of it. Like what you are stating could be true, but it's based on the assumptions that what we do is finite, or what we can do is finite. And that finite thing includes going to meetings, attending meetings, and doing things which we may or may not find useful. So, from my perspective, what I see is if that gets automated, actually that frees me up to do things that I really would love to do or what I'm good at. And that makes me, somebody would call it a 10x marketer or a 100x marketer or a 100x journalist or a 100x engineer. The second assumption over there is that if something or some entity already knows what I want to do and what is my next step, I think it's okay as long as it's not letting me influence my next action. And I don't think there is going to be, at least in the near future, a fully autonomous thing that can do things on our behalf without our permission. And that's where I think I have a more optimistic view of the future, where we will be able to automate and do things that are probably lower value to us, which frees up with more of the things that we want to do and is unique to us. And that helps us do more and it helps us do other things that we had probably not thought about.
In that case, how should enterprises prepare for this shift towards AI agents, and particularly when it comes to protecting their data and their security posture?
Yeah, so this is where I think enterprises have to differentiate with the data or the knowledge that they have. And today, at least in my 20 plus years of experience in this field, every large enterprise that I've spoken to have several different myriad of databases. They might have Hadoop, they might have Snowflake, they might have maybe even Databricks, they might have MongoDB, they might have MySQL or Postgres. And you have data silos or data sitting in different parts. And there's a lot of data movement going on back and forth. So what this ends up leading to, or the consequence of this, is that now there is lower efficiency in how you access the data. There is more cost because data is moving and now you have to have additional tool. It is also adds latency of how you access the data. And then finally, it is, not accurate data because you might have multiple pieces of data. Some of it might be stale, some of it might be fresh, some of it might be duplicate, and you don't know how to manage those. So I do feel for companies that manage to take that complexity and convert it into a simplified interface that gives access to agents to be able to make decisions quickly will be the true differentiators. And so there are two different ways to go about it. You can keep the ensemble databases that you have, and then maybe you add another database called vector only database. And now you are doing more data movements, right? But you kind of sort of have become a quote unquote AI company. Or the other one is you realize that you need an interface that can curate all of that data in several different interfaces and be able to give that data to large language models or agents in a few milliseconds. And that's where I think the enterprises would be more focused towards, is to how to enable that. Now, the other question that you did ask is also spot on. So let's say, again, you're in EM360. Now, there's certain data that is confidential and based on roles and titles of the people. For example, there might be merger and acquisition data that is privileged and could only be accessible by certain people within the company. But there are other data that is personally identifier information, like people's pay stubs and their salaries and things like that. Now, if you take all of that knowledge and you immediately open it up to a large language model, which is then interfacing with your customer, how do you manage that data access? Like the large language model is just going to go do a semantic search and return it. Like, how do you manage who gets to see what? So that's where the data governance, the data access comes in. The second thing is mostly you want to be able to manage the data in a way that it is not inauditable, for example, or not inexplainable. For example, if I asked a question and then somebody else asked that same question, somebody should be able to look at that audit record and say, okay, seems like this was correct, but this was not correct. And then you want to quote unquote retrain your data or you recalibrate the responses. So there have to be things like guardrails. There have some things to be like evals. And all of those things are extremely important in the enterprise world versus B2C, where it's all publicly available data.
Definitely. So, if we circle back to real time AI, what significant business advantages does it offer? And if you can talk about the broader impact of it.
Yeah, I think the biggest differentiator it offers is the accuracy of data because now you're dealing with real time data. It offers you with exceptional human agent interface because you're talking to some other entity or software or hardware that has the same up to date knowledge as you, but it's reasoning along the same lines and you're able to do certain things with it much faster. And companies that are able to do that will be the next $1 trillion companies, right? Those are the companies that will be ahead. And so a lot of the companies that have very massive data, you can see they are emerging as big AI companies. For example, Tesla has a massive amount of data and they're using to build their Grok models. Facebook has massive amounts of data and they're using the Llama models. And I'm pretty sure they have access to a lot more different data sets. Similarly, anybody with a large data set, if you have access to those and you're able to manage that in a very or harness that in a much efficient way, those are the ones that are going to be more successful in my mind.
I suppose with large language models and big companies, we have noticed how they've become $1 trillion. Companies have taken advantage of modern AI, I suppose, in a way. But what new opportunities are there for relatively smaller businesses to tap into in this industry? And if we can talk about the potential risks that they should be mindful of, especially hallucinations and misuse of AI. Because with LLMs, I feel like training them, of course, is quite critical, as you have highlighted above. But that's not enough to always get them to answer you in the right way, no matter how much you train it.
Yeah. So, from the perspective of smaller companies or new applications, if you look at the use of AI, at least in the enterprises, one of the biggest use cases is coding. There are companies like Cursor that have gone from zero to $100 million in like 2 years or less. And so, what that has spurred is an entire sub industry of people who they don't need to be software engineers and they can create an end to end app by themselves. And so we're talking about micro SaaS or, micro end to end full stack applications that people are using to build. And they're the ones who are in many ways the early wealth creators in this economy. So from that perspective, I think it comes back to who are the infrastructure providers for those companies. You would need a API layer, but you would need a database, right? Every single one of these companies would need a database and APIs, and they would need the infrastructure to run those applications. So that's where the cloud companies come in, right? So those are the places where I think that does come up. Now, famously, Mark Benioff has talked about how, or actually it was Satya Nadella, and then Mark Benioff had the back and forth with him, is that based on top of the data, whatever is your business logic, things like Salesforce, they become a key differentiator, but the UI goes away because the UI is now commodity. Anybody could go build it out. So I think for smaller companies as well as larger companies, it comes back to what is the value you're providing at the business logic level based on verticals, like for healthcare, for real estate, all the other non-tech companies, and what is the underlying data that you're harnessing in order to create that. That is the moat that will be built by these companies in my mind.
That sounds very exciting to me, and I hope smaller businesses do end up taking advantage of the advancing technologies, especially in terms of real time AI and its developments. I'm looking forward to that revolution. If you had to summarize one takeaway for CIOs or C levels from today's conversation, what would it be and why?
Yeah, I'm obviously biased, but I would say it is how you harness your data is going to be supremely important. And in fact, it's going to be the table stakes. And that would include both in terms of accuracy, access, security, as well as freshness of that data. And if I were a CIO somewhere, that would be my first task is how do I create an interface which gives AI access to the data in the right and responsible fashion, but also in a low latency fashion.
Okay, that's great advice. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming on. Also, thank you to everyone listening. We hope you took a lot from today's podcast. For further information on what we've talked about, then please head on over to singlestore.com. We'll be back next time with another episode in our podcast series. Until then, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on all major platforms. Follow the conversation on our socials at EM360 Tech on X and LinkedIn. And for more great daily content, head on over to em360tech.com. Thank you so much, Madhukar, for today.
Thank you, Shubhangi.